What's up, everybody? We are live. It's been a while. Been at the Olympic trials, coaching people to multiple Olympics. It's pretty cool. This year we got two newcomers to the Olympics and three people made it to the Olympics for the second or third time. So that's something I'm really freaking proud of because it's really hard to make the Olympics once, let alone make the Olympics twice. Or three times in the case of Alex Rose. So it's pretty neat to be a part of that in this past week, too, at the Olympic trials. Like being with Sam, working through the hardest discus final since like 1976. And him going out and making that team was just freaking awesome. And then he's going to be joining Chama Onyekwera for her second Olympics, and then again Alex Rose for his third. And then we got, this isn't official yet, but Eric Favors has made the Olympic team for Ireland, and Obajeri Amici has made it for Nigeria as well. So we got 5 people going along with myself. I leave July 24th, but that's not what we're going to talk about today. I want to talk about endurance training for athletes, and really I want to get deep into a lot of different stuff around what I think about endurance, how we train for specific sports, even sports like powerlifting and sports like weightlifting, sports like even to a point maybe we could even argue bodybuilding and what that endurance aspect looks like, and then going all the way into what we're going to be covering when we're talking about building out and recognizing those sports versus let's say a soccer player versus a marathoner, an ultra marathoner, or anything like that. And so I want to go into quickly too. Yeah, Cece is going this time. And Cece, this is for RAC 979. Cece actually made it in 21. However, her NGB did not do their job. So she was actually in the village. She was there. She was training. She was throwing. She was ready to compete. And then she wasn't allowed to be there anymore. Because Nigeria decided to drop the ball on some things. So I wanted to get into some of the big aspects around endurance training and some of the stuff that I've had in the past where it's like, first, I think it's important to be as clear as possible as a strength and conditioning coach. And remember, it's strength and conditioning, S&C. Okay, and I would argue conditioning would follow under that endurance umbrella. And when we're looking at, if some people would argue, well, conditioning is just being prepared for a specific sport, I would just throw in conditioning to me is legitimately meaning like an endurance component. And if we're looking at specific sports, we have to understand what those components might be. And we also have to recognize that a strength coach is typically going to come up the ranks and they're going to coach people in one of two ways. So one of two ways, okay? So the first manner is that if we were raised in a specific system, if we were trained in a specific system, if we came through in a specific training system and we did well as athletes and we were athletic and we performed well and we had a good athletic career, it's highly likely that that is the system that we will implement when coaching our athletes, okay? The second modification would be if I'm a strength coach and I was trained or coached through a specific system, but as I made progress or as I aged and got through this system, maybe when I went to college, I was exposed to another system or I didn't perform well as an athlete, then what I end up doing is now I switch my system. So let's say I was raised in a powerlifting system, but I didn't do well as an athlete. Then on this side, I tend to flip and say, well, I'm not going to train people that way because that's what lacked in, or that caused problems in my training as an athlete. And so I'm going to train this way, which is completely different. That's really how we operate as strength coaches. Like that's where most of our ideologies come from. It comes from our past and whether or not our past was successful or not. Okay, so that's like the big background that I think we all have to understand as coaches or as athletes is like usually the system that you like is based around minimal amount of research or minimal amount of implementation of research, but more so around past experience. Okay. And also that's okay. That's sort of how we go about living our lives as well. So we just need to be clear with that. Now, what that means for endurance is that most strength coaches don't know anything about endurance because we like to lift weights. We are a heavily resistance-based group of individuals. Okay. Most people who were into endurance and into, let's just say, endurance-based training. So let's think about a marathoner or an ultra swimmer or anything like that. They don't get into S&C. These people get into the specific sports. They tend to coach marathon. They tend to coach ultras. They tend to coach, triathletes. They tend to coach endurance cyclists. They don't get into a more general realm of strength and conditioning, and we have to recognize that. That's okay. But then what that means for us as a realm or as a community of coaches is that somebody's calling me right now. What that means for us as coaches is that we have to be aware that, okay, now we can recognize that we don't have the best understanding of endurance. And the reason being is, like, one, there's a lot of research out there, but we don't spend time analyzing it, or maybe we're just overwhelmed by it. That was me. I was overwhelmed by it. Two, there's a lot of resources out there. So if we watch endurance-based researchers, I'm thinking about someone like Steven Seiler. Okay, Steven Seiler, probably one of the best out there as far as putting out content and also doing the research. He has so much information that you get overwhelmed and you don't know how to apply it. And then you factor in the aspect of, let's just say, social media as well. So you bring in the world of social media, and that also makes it hard to bring in, we have our goldfish brain, and we're trying to understand what our training system is. We're trying to comprehend where we're going with everything. And then you bring in these really cool, unique exercises that you might see on social, and you want to implement that into your training system. So you're overwhelmed. And it basically comes back to, we never really create this really tried and true endurance system the way we do strength system. Okay. And I want to just analyze that. Then it comes down to, now we have like 5 to 7 key components that I sort of call these false beliefs that just end up being like a very, very clear false belief that it ends up being like 100%. We all sort of have this this mindset that strong athletes don't need endurance. Okay. So it's basically like, okay, when I was strong, when I was in high school, I played football, my endurance was pretty bad, but I was strong, so it was okay. I don't need endurance. Then the next false belief, and that's not accurate. The next false belief is, all right, well, I was an athlete, and I think people who do train endurance are weak. And there's like there's a meme of Dwayne Chambers looking super jacked, and he's sprinting, and he's next to this Finnish guy who's like a super skinny, frail looking marathoner. And it's like, do you want to train like the distance runner and look like the frail Finnish guy? Or do you want to do sprints and lift heavy weights like Dwayne Chambers and be super jacked? And so that's like this meme of the contrast between the two. So you're constantly told you can't do this, right? You shouldn't do this because only weak people need endurance. And then you start to think through, like, another misconception is like, well, you can't get strong and do endurance work and improve your endurance at the same time. It's not possible. Like that, a lot of people think that, right? We think we can't do that. And for myself personally, when I started to really question all this was when I started to see sprint cyclists, and I would hear them say, yeah, I'm going out for like a 40-mile ride. Okay, I'm going out for a 50-mile ride. Well, that's pretty long. It's a decent amount of endurance work. Or, working with Nick Wazowski, like, yeah, I'm going to be wrestling for about an hour and a half. Well, that's pretty long. Okay. And then I started to read about some of the CrossFitters, somebody like Matt Frazier, who every single morning was getting on a rower and spending an hour and a half, 2 hours on the rower. And so he's doing, I will be answering questions, bing bong, but I'm trying to get through some of this endurance background stuff before we get into the questions. So then we're going through all this, and we're going, another false belief is, all right, you can't get strong and improve endurance. Meanwhile, sprint cyclists are back squatting 550 pounds, 600 pounds, and they're going out for 50-mile rides. Okay, well, that's a little weird. Nick, when he was working with us, could clean 160 kilos, and he could also go on the bike for over an hour plus at a really high tempo. Well, he was strong, and he had good endurance. Matt Frazier was continuously hitting PRs in his squats and his cleans and his snatches while increasing his endurance. So that was pretty weird. Like that's another concept. So then we get into some more false beliefs, and I'll try and make this as quick as I can where we're going through, and you're saying you can't do any technical work and do cardio. And this is sort of rooted in like the touch and go cycling cleans or cycling snatches that you might see the CrossFit world do. You can't do that. That's not going to improve your endurance. And I don't think that you should be doing that, but you can do technical things and improve your endurance. Okay, then another misconception. Running is like the best way to increase your endurance. You don't do anything else. That's false. I've talked with Daniel Stahl, who's a world champion, Olympic champion discus thrower, and he goes for walks every single morning. And when he doesn't walk, he feels like he decreases the amount of volume of throws that he can do on a given training session. So the walking is actually what's helping him improve his overall endurance. Same light. We always think like you're either running and puking. There's the old adage in track and field where it's like, hey, I'd rather throw than run and puke. And so it's sort of like, I don't do any endurance because I don't want to run and puke. Yes, it's funny. It's true to a point, but in all reality, I think there are components of throwing. I think there are components of football. There are components of wrestling that we do need to focus on all of these different aspects of endurance. And so that's where we're going to get into when we start. Sorry. That's where we're going to get into when we really start to think through this lens. Because once we can start to analyze what are we rooted? Why do we have this preconceived notions? Why do we have these thought processes? Where are they rooted in? And then how can we sort of deconstruct those beliefs to create a training system? Okay. And so when we start to look at some different concepts, then now you're going to see like, all right, well, if I can train specific things for endurance, or if I can train specific things for different athlete types, that's going to help us make some more progress. And so I'm going to share this quick video here. We're going to look at this, and then we're going to really dive deep into some more endurance-based work.
How much strength work, how much speed work, and how much endurance work, okay? So we have to create some sense of a profile. Force velocity profiling, I do not believe is the most effective, mainly because there is not an inverse relationship between force and velocity. I think it's more effective to create a profile for specific sports and specific athletes based off impulse, strength, speed, endurance. And so if we're looking at football players, okay, we're gonna have 25% of their training be impulse-based. So that might be plyometric-based. That might be even in the weight room doing things like unbroken at certain percentages, at certain tempos. Then we're gonna look at the football player for strength-based training. And this is gonna be a general analysis. Inside of our strength training at peak strength, one thing that we do is we try to separate overall, if we look at strength, most football players will be in the weight room 35% of their time. Then we can look at that speed work. About 25% of their training should go towards some type of speed work. This could be hill sprints, this could be sled sprints, anything like that, right? Even running mechanics. And then finally, endurance should make up, check out that sweet lungs with the heart, should make up about 10 to 15% of their overall training. All right, and if we compare that to that 5K runner, we might see 10 to 15% of their work is impulse-based, so some type of jumping, maybe even some type of faster lifting. Then we look at their strength work. We've got to make sure that they have some type of stability, some type of structural stability, so that they have injury prevention. That's going to be about 10%. Then we start to look at speed and endurance. Think about Nico Young. He just broke the 5K NCAA record. He just won the NCAA title.
He just qualified for the Olympics in the 10K.
He is extraordinarily fast. And that speed work will be about 25% of their overall training. Okay, and then endurance work is going to be about 50% of their overall training. That could involve.
Okay, so I wanted to share that with you there to show you guys, okay, this is what we're really going to be trying to hammer home is breaking down based off of what the video showed, starting to break things down and starting to see where everything is rooted. Okay, so where everything sort of flows and how everything in the training system is based out of a specific profile. Okay, so I think that's a really, really important concept there is to understand. let's see if I can move this over. I wanted to share this with you. There we go. Although that is not showing up as well as I thought it would. I don't think, yeah, you guys will not be able to see it in that way. So let me go over here. Do you see that? Yes. Okay, so if I keep it like that, I think you guys can see. Let me know if you can see that inside of the chat on YouTube. Let me know if you guys are able to check that out. Because Samuel just asked, how should I train for elite endurance and season for Olympic handball, the amount of LSD, sauna work, stuff like that. And so that's going to lead us into really starting to understand where all this stuff is based out of. And it starts with, what we're referring to as sport depth. So the big factor here is understanding there's going to be essentially 3 types of endurance forms that we look towards, okay? And when we see these 3 types of endurance, we're going to look at, I would classify sarcoplasmic hypertrophy as one type of endurance. And under that, there might be a couple other methods that you can use, but the umbrella is based off of sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. Then if we're looking at increasing mitochondrial volume or increasing hemoglobin mass, that's going to be the second type, okay? So that's going to be sort of like you're looking at LSD work right there. That's going to be a lot of long, slower stuff, and you can have splits off of that, but the big picture is starting here, okay? The third type of endurance is going to be improving cardiac output. Okay, so if we're looking at how explosive our heart can be, okay, and how much force our heart can put out so we can pump more blood at it from one stroke, so the stroke volume increases, that's going to be that last type of endurance. That's going to lead to greater mitochondrial respiration, okay? Because now we're going to have the LSD is helping us have more capillarization. We're going to have more hemoglobin mass, more red blood cell mass. That's why athletes who get tested positive, they test positive for performance-enhancing drugs, they're usually on something like nandrolone, which can increase red blood cell mass. EPO can increase red blood cell mass and lead to greater capillarization. So that's where those performance-enhancing drugs do fall into their improvement in sports performance. Okay, so if we can think through that, now all of a sudden we're going, okay, so that's the forms of endurance. Now, in this case, with the sport depths, what we do is now we take those concepts and we start to break down energy systems. Okay, so in the simplest thought process possible, the energy systems, we're going to look at something like alactic energy system, which is going to use creatine phosphate. We are not using a carbohydrate or oxygen. Okay. We are not using oxygen or carbohydrate to create ATP. Okay, this is going to be something where now we have ATP, which is the energy currency in our body. We have to do everything that we're doing, even sitting here right now, I'm using ATP. Okay, so we have to have ATP. And if we're doing something super, super explosive, the alactic system is what we're going to be using. Okay, if we're doing something that might be lasting like 15 to 60 seconds, 15 seconds to 60 seconds, that's typically maybe 15 to 90 seconds. That's typically where we're going to see mainly everything is going to be focused on the glycolytic energy system, where we will be using carbohydrates to generate more ATP. About for every molecule, about like, I want to say it's 4 to 6 molecules of ATP. Then we look at the aerobic oxidative system. Okay, the aerobic system is going to be using oxygen to create ATP, and it's going to be about 32 molecules. Okay, so when we start to think through the energy systems, that's where we can start to differentiate the types of endurance needed, but that's rooted in what type of sport the athlete is involved with. Okay, so if they are squatting, like Haley is right here, how many reps? How long in their sport? What's it look like? Okay, Nicholas, okay, he's a running back. He doesn't really need a ton of oxidative work, but he still does need oxidative work, because the other factor is the healthier our aerobic capacity is, typically the more effective our other two energy systems are. So when we start to think about this as far as training is concerned, Okay, I'm going to try and move this over, see if you guys can see this here. We really can start to look at, all right, in each and every single sport, we're going to have essentially 4 key characteristics. And one of the things I want to share with you is this document. If you guys are in our chat right now on YouTube, or if you're on TikTok, or if you're on Instagram, you can go over to YouTube and you can actually download this link, because it's like I want to say it's like a 13 or 15 page paper. So you can click on the link that's in the chat. It's the free resource. It's actually pinned to the top of the chat. You click on that and you're going to get all of this information spoon-fed to you, where we go into, okay, how much endurance is really needed in these specific sports. Then when we break down how much endurance is needed, what type of endurance is needed. So now we look at explosiveness, endurance, speed, and strength. And I think it's important for us as strength coaches to understand, in all reality, the only things that we're trying to move, the only levers that we're trying to move, the only adaptations that we're looking for are based off of these 4 factors. Okay, that's it. If we're trying to improve someone's sports performance, we're literally just trying to get them stronger, get them to be more, to have more endurance, to get faster, or to be more explosive. That's it. Endurance, being more explosive, strength, speed. Okay, speed being running, more explosive being, can they jump higher? Can they do something super twitchy? Endurance is meaning they're able to endure something under a massive amount of stress for a long period of time. And then finally, strength, how much force into an object can they put out? And that's it. That's the only 4 things that we're looking at. Those are the adaptations. And so when you look through on this document here, again, you guys can download this inside of the YouTube chat. When we're looking at that, we have to start to understand why it matters, okay? And in what sports do these things matter? And then how can we evaluate them? And that's where a lot of the endurance stuff comes back to, is like, we have to figure out, okay, if we can differentiate explosiveness and speed and strength, then we can start to look at specific sports that need more endurance, what type of endurance they need, and then we can evaluate it. And I think that's the big factor here, is that once we start to understand the type of endurance that a sport needs, then we can go further into, all right, if they need this, how can we create a program to improve that? And then finally, how can we evaluate it to make sure that they're going in the right direction? Okay, so in this case, you can see up on the screen, and I'm going to share a real quick example here. A good way to test endurance: run a 5K. Literally just go out and run a 5K. And if you're in a sport, which we're going to go into this a little bit further, if you're in a sport where, let's just say it's soccer, it's lacrosse, you might be running quite a bit. You might be covering, basketball runs about 5 miles a game. Soccer runs about 7.5 to 8 miles a game, sometimes even more. If you're in a sport that covers a lot of ground in the competitive time frame, you're going to need a strong oxidative system. Okay. And a real easy thing to do is to time a 5K. And when you time your 5K, try to get 1 mile splits. I know it sounds weird. You're like sort of doing, you're doing the 1,000, or you're doing a metric run with a standard test, but you can basically just say, okay, I'm going to run 3.1 miles. What's my 1 mile split throughout the entire run? And then I can see, do I have a good system that enables me to hold a steady state, or do I die off after like 15 minutes? Okay, so then you can start to see if I'm a soccer player and I'm running quite a bit, I can start to see where I lack. Okay, so then that's going to take us into the way that we test these. And now I'm going to get into some of the sport depth stuff, because I think this is where it gets really important. And the way that we can really start to comprehend sports is to look through the 4 strength characteristics that we laid out. Okay, so you lay out the 4 strength characteristics. Then you have research, and this is where we're spoon feeding this to you, where I can sit there and I say, okay, based off of the training focus ratios. Okay, so I have a training focus ratio. I've talked with sport coaches. I am a sport coach of a lot of athletes in Sport Depth 1. We've gone through a lot of experimentation. We've done a lot of research. We've analyzed research. based off of success of these athletes and the athletes that we've gotten to an elite level, about 40 to 43% of their time training is going to be around strength work. About 40 to 43% of their time training is going to be around explosive work. About 10% of their time will be around locomotive-based work. And that's why you can see we've got weightlifting, we've got powerlifting, we have goalies, soccer goalies. They sort of all fall into that same area. And then you have endurance. 5% of their time will be done doing endurance work. So when we start to think through, all right, in this case, a goalie would be doing some type of easier endurance work. They don't need to run a lot. They just need to hold their focus late into a match, okay, similar to a weightlifter, similar to a shot putter. They need to be able to compete for a long period of time, but they're not doing a lot of constant action. They need to be as explosive as possible, and then that's essentially it. And so the endurance work that we would be doing would be some type of sarcoplasmic work, okay? And so what I would want to see there for a test, for an evaluation, is you get a shot putter, and let's say it's in the fall. They're far out from a competition, and you can analyze them and say, or a weightlifter, you can say, okay, let's say you back squat something 100 kilos for 5 reps. Let's try to do a 10 rep max. Okay, they do a 10 rep max, and they can only 10 rep max 110 kilos. They don't have a lot of endurance. Okay, well, let's just try to improve that and get them to be able to hit a 10 rep max at 120, and then they can do a 5 rep max at 100, something like that, or 110, something where there's a little bit more of a gap. So then you can try to improve the form of endurance specific to this sport depth. And in this sport depth 1, it's going to be mainly based around sarcoplasmic work, because they're basically going to be focusing on the glycolytic system or the alactic system. Now, one thing that we also need to bring up here is that they will find some success once or twice a week doing some slow distance work, very, very easy assault bike work. This is where the example of Daniel Stahl going out for walks can pay off. This is the point where sitting on the assault bike for 30 minutes, maybe you pedal at 50 RPMs, that's going to pay off, and it's going to help them with their endurance in the circle. It's going to help them with their overall performance. This is also where I believe a lot of these athletes getting into the sauna on a regular basis will also pay off quite a bit. Okay, you get into the sauna 4 to 5 days a week as a sport depth 1, that's going to pay off. Now, when we get into sport depth 2, again, you guys can download this. It's tagged at the top of the chat. And you guys can look at this and check this out. So if you're on Instagram or TikTok, check that out. Also, this week on Wednesday, I am presenting at the NSCA National Convention. I'm going to be presenting on endurance work, covering how we train endurance with wrestlers, how we train endurance with other sports. It's going to be crazy. It's going to be like an hour and a half, I think. Okay, so getting into sport depth 2. This is the sport depth that we're going to refer to as speed and power. So these are the sports where you're going to be mainly focusing on alactic usage and glycolytic usage. We also have to remember that when we're working on alactic and glycolytic, no matter what, the healthier our aerobic capacity is, the better those will be. Okay, and likely the quicker we will recover. So this might be a sport like baseball, a sport like football, I do believe is more like speed and power. They have a lot of breaks. It's interval based. So a sport like rugby. And then you can start to look at even jumps on the runway for a long jumper, something like that, then even gymnastics, and to a point sprint cycling. I think sprint cycling sort of goes back and forth between sport depth 2 and sport depth 3. But if we're looking at this, you can see here with the training focus ratios, 44% of their training should be based around explosive work, 22% should be based around strength work, 22% should be based around speed, 12% based around endurance. The reason why I believe more of their work should be based around speed than the sport depth 1 is that these athletes, these sports typically have more locomotion. Also, if we're focusing on speed, we will see some improvements in endurance. We will see some improvements in explosiveness, and they might even see some strength gains. So if we can sort of cater and understand that this is all rooted in discussions with sport coaches, in research, in understanding adaptations, now we can work forward from there. Okay, so that's going to be, and in this case, when we're thinking through the lens of endurance, these sport depth individuals would benefit from maybe once a week some slower, longer distance work. So they get on the assault bike for an hour and it's nice and easy. But they're also going to be benefiting from sprint work. Okay, so think about an ice hockey player. They go out and they do, 8 60-meter sprints. They're going to have some endurance improvements from that. But also, if they get on the bike once a week and they do some type of interval-based training, maybe they do a Tabata, maybe they do 5 minutes of 2 or 5 sets of 2-minute goes on the assault bike, they're going to improve their overall cardio, and they're not going to tax their strength system. They're not going to tax their explosiveness. They're still going to be doing well. Okay, so then we get into sport depth 3, and we actually refer to this as like strength endurance, but more so the keystone sport depth, mainly because of the wrestling aspect and what goes into this level. Okay, so sport depth 3, and if we can think through the training ratios that we've provided you, okay, so we look at the training ratios, and then we look at the fact that you're going to be going into an opposition. There will be an opponent that you have to go against in wrestling. There's going to be an opponent that you have to go against in MMA, in judo, in karate. So they will be pushing back into you. So now we have to think, okay, that's going to take a lot of strength. So that's probably going to be the glycolytic system, maybe a little bit of the alactic system. But the bouts might last 5-minute rounds. It might be 3 5-minute rounds. In boxing, it might be 10 3-minute rounds. It might be even longer. It used to be for freestyle wrestling, you do 1 5-minute round. So now you're looking at these things, and you're even getting into a sport like canoe, and you might have a 5,000-meter sprint. So now you have to think through that lens of, okay, how can we train endurance and explosiveness and strength? And we have to go back to the training ratios. Okay, so if we understand the training ratios, then we're going to be looking at this and saying, okay, we have strength, which is going to be about 35% of their training. Okay, we have explosiveness, which is going to be about 30% of their training. We have endurance around 25% of their training. So 1/4 of their sessions will be solely focused on endurance work, and then about 10% on speed. Now, the reason with sport depth 3 we have a lower speed aspect is because they don't have a ton of locomotion. They're going to have more hand-to-hand combat work. So they don't need to necessarily sprint faster over 50 meters, because we're looking at wrestling, jiu-jitsu, judo, boxing, canoe, rowing, karate, sports like that. So they're not actually doing any locomotive work. Okay, that's why I would argue to a point we could sneak sprint cycling into this aspect as well, because if we can get them stronger and we can get them more explosive, and then we can also train their endurance work quite a bit, now they're going to start to be absolute freaks. Okay, so then we get into sport depth 4, and I want to lay out the 5 sport depths, and I'm going to answer some of the questions in here. Do I think throwers should use some shorts? I think throwers can benefit from short sprints for explosiveness, but I don't think they have to. Why is Yaime asking? Yaime is asking to come into our live chat on TikTok. I just noticed that. She wants to appear as a guest on TikTok. That would be absolute mayhem if Yaime was in here. I'm still mad at you, Yaime, that you didn't throw today. Okay, so if we get into sport depth 4, this is going to be the continuous go. Okay, so these are the athletes that might be doing skiing, snowboarding, lacrosse, field hockey, soccer, handball, tennis. So there's more locomotive work. Okay, and then we can look at, okay, now, and I did want to talk about something quickly, but now we're looking at 35% of their work is going to be speed-based. Okay, 25% of their work is going to be explosive work. 20% is going to be endurance-based, 20% is going to be strength-based. And where that comes from is talking to sports coaches, talking through and reading research, understanding the impact that speed can have with a carryover into the endurance realm to a point, understanding their sport practice and what that practice can do for their overall endurance, and then looking at their benchmarks, okay? And so in the easiest sense, what this document here is, what this is showing you is, okay, the sport needs these key ratios to be trained, okay? Then, after the key ratios are identified, the next way that we have to think through this is, how can we evaluate this? If we can identify what is needed, and then we can analyze the athlete and then look at the actual benchmarks. Okay, so we set these benchmarks ahead of time based off the sport quality. then we can look at it and say, okay, for this athlete to be good, this is how we evaluate where they are. And then when we evaluate them, we analyze the graph and we can relate the graph back to the training ratios to then predict where our training has to go. But if we don't have the system laid out ahead of time, we don't know where they need to go. So if we spend time analyzing the sports and we spend time talking with sport coaches, and then we spend time deciphering the best way to test them and evaluate them, now we can see what type of endurance they actually need. So that's sort of where everything is just constantly being refined here. And then we get into Sport Depth 5. So Sport Depth 5 is going to be like the great distance. This is going to be where you do see marathoners. You do see endurance athletes. So if you guys are on Instagram, you're on TikTok, you can come over to YouTube and you can check out this entire free resource. You can download the resource. It's inside of our chat. Once you download it, you're going to see all this stuff. You're going to see, okay, if we're talking about Sport Depth 5 athlete, now we're looking at a marathoner, a triathlete, a cross-country skier, middle distance to even further on the track, distance cycling. And the way that we can test them is going to be analyzing a 1 mile run, a single leg squat, a 40-yard dash. We will still need those things to improve speed. If we can improve speed in a marathoner, they might improve their overall cadence / pace when they're running. If we can test their single leg squat and just recognize that the benchmark is going to be much lower for a marathoner, and we can just slightly increase their single leg squat, their power output is going to be drastically higher. Okay, so then if we can analyze their vertical jump, we can do the same thing, their 20-yard shuttle. Things along these lines that will be a little bit more applicable to athletes that tend to run quite a bit and they run long distances. Okay, so then we can look at it, and from the training perspective, the irony here is that as coaches, we need to back off the endurance work and communicate with the sport coach and say, hey, coach, at this point, I don't want to do any endurance work. All of the endurance work is in the sport. It's literally how much swimming are you doing? That's your endurance. They do everything around their actual sport endurance. We in the Sport Depth 5 have to do everything around maintaining health. Okay? Can we keep their knees healthy, their hips healthy, their lower back healthy, their ankles healthy? Can we maintain integrity? Can we increase their speed while having as little impact on their training in general? Okay, if we can have as positive of an impact as possible so that they can become more explosive and faster without gaining weight, so that then on a long period of time they become more explosive, but they can still achieve their distances in shorter time frames, that's going to improve their overall performance. So the big concept here, and again, you guys can pick this up, is your video an only plyo exercise you need good for basketball? Yes, bing bong, 100%. You guys can pick this up by downloading this. And I'm going to be doing an hour-plus long presentation on Wednesday at the NSCA convention. And you can even live stream that next week. So if you guys want to check that out, you can. Now, I want to come back here and try to solidify this a little bit. And then I'm going to get into the questions. I'm going to try and wrap everything up from the presentation aspect as easily as I can. Let me see if I can. I'm trying to get something up on my computer here. Let's go right here. Okay, so if I'm looking at this in its simplest form, okay, you have the athletes. You understand what type of endurance they need. You got sarcoplasmic endurance. You got endurance that's going to lead to greater mitochondrial volume. We've got endurance that leads to greater cardiac output. Okay. So you have those three things there. Then you over here, you're looking at, okay, now we got the alactic energy system, the glycolytic energy system, the aerobic energy system. Okay. So you got endurance, then you got the systems of energy usage here. Then you have the four components that you know that the only four things that we have to do as a strength and conditioning coach is increase their endurance, increase their speed, increase their strength, or increase their explosiveness. That's it. Okay. So then as you work through, you go through each and every sport, which we've done inside the sport depths. And now you say, okay, this sport needs this much of this sport needs this much of that. And now you're looking at it and you have a way to evaluate the athlete. You have a way to evaluate and compare it because we use benchmarks to compare them. And then you have a way to train them. So then when you're looking at best ways to train an athlete, if I'm looking at a soccer player and I know that by minute 70, if we have a 90-minute game, they're dead. They can't move. And that same athlete is super fast. It's very likely we need to work on their aerobic capacity. It's very likely we need to get them in the sauna 4 days a week, and they need to go on the assault bike for an hour and a half to 2 hours once or twice a week at a low intensity and just hammer home increasing their overall blood volume, because we know what that adaptation is. Okay, if I have a shot putter who takes 10 throws in practice and they get super freaking tired, I know based off of what their sport depth is that they need more sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, and they need to improve that. And they also need to do some work with some slow distance, because that won't have a negative impact on their recovery. Okay, so that's like where I wanted to take everything, how I wanted to communicate and clarify that. Hopefully that helps. And then get into some of these questions. Would you say the endurance basics are walking, running, biking? Biking would be an airdyne, a road bike, a stationary bike, swimming, and then sauna. And I would say you could throw in, ski erg or anything like that. I do think you could throw that in. Like, you didn't include cross-country skiing, but I would almost say cross-country skiing could be, and this might trigger some people, it could be almost a form of running if you're looking at it that way. But in all reality, I think walking, running, biking, swimming, sauna, I think are the best ways to look at it. I don't mind, and I want to bring this up, is that when I think about like sport-specific endurance with technique, so in the world of wrestling, they'll do something that's known as sparring or live drilling even, or like flow wrestling. And live drilling is going to be much more intense, and you might have interval training. So if you have athletes come back, and if you have the resource like a VO2 master where you can sort of analyze everybody's VO2 max, and you need to drastically increase their VO2 max, you might use live drilling. Okay, if everybody comes back and their VO2 max is high, but they, maybe there's a problem with how they handle a full day of a tournament, they need more long, slow distance. So in that case, I might say go do 35 minutes of sparring, and that's when sparring is like sort of flow wrestling. You're just moving through. Your heart rate might get up to 125 to 130, and when the heart rate gets to 125, 130, you try and hold that for 30 minutes. Okay, so that's like another aspect. One thing I also like to do with this is looking at with endurance is like, if I have a wrestler, how quickly can they decrease their resting heart rate? Meaning, if we do a bout of something at a high intensity, so let's say they do 30 minutes on the assault bike at 75 RPMs, or 30 seconds. So they do 30 seconds on the assault bike at 75 RPMs, and their heart rate gets up to like 165. When that bout of 30 seconds ends, they were at 165, 170. How quickly can we get their heart rate down? How quickly can we get their heart rate down to about 130? So we might even try and get their heart rate up to like 180, 185, and then analyze, okay, within a minute, can they get their heart rate down to about 130? Because that's going to help us with that recovery heart rate. Then we're going to see how well prepared they are based off their sport. And this might be the same thing that we're looking at for a thrower. What's their heart rate get to? What's their heart rate get to when they take a throw versus in between rounds? Okay, so like that's important stuff to analyze when we're trying to improve those specific scenarios. Luke had just asked, how when you train explosiveness with sled sprints, what percentage of body weight should I put on the sled? Typically, that's going to be about 10%. I would start with. Just start at 10%. And if you feel like it's not having an impact, decrease that body weight that's on that, go down to 7%. Or if you feel like you don't have a good acceleration path, maybe you can increase that a little bit. Just recognize that you're going to see different adaptations. And I think that that's the overarching theme here, is that when we're trying to improve an athlete, we have to think about the adaptation that we're looking for. And then we have to analyze the physiology behind it to know how to get that adaptation. That's the biggest thing with endurance work, is that if we can analyze, we're trying to improve cardiac output, or we're trying to improve hemoglobin mass or mitochondrial volume, or we're trying to improve sarcoplasm in a muscular cell so that we can have more muscle protein synthesis. Those are three different adaptations that we just discussed, and they're exemplified through three different tactics of endurance. One through, longer sets of, 15 to 30 reps for sarcoplasm induction into the cell. Cardiac output is going to be more so based around high intensity interval work, usually with like let's say a 3 to 5 minute go followed by a 2 to 3 minute rest. And then long slow distance is going to be what we use to increase hemoglobin mass. So a 30-minute to 2-hour jog, a 30-minute to 2-hour ride on an assault bike or a rower or anything like that. So I hope that helps with that. Any thoughts on John Bros and his weightlifting methods of maxing out all the time? This is from Bobby Big Duck. I don't know if John's still around in the weightlifting world. I actually, weird story. I won a bet off of John once because we bet on an athlete. We were in Tokyo, Japan at a world championships, and we bet on an athlete hitting a lift, hitting a total, 400K total. They didn't hit it. John paid me. He did pay me. That's his system, dude. I would say this. Like, I think with all this stuff, it's important to realize that's John's system. That's how John coaches his athletes. I don't do that. I have my own training system on the system that we've used to develop the athletes that we've had on world teams, the athletes that we've had qualify for the Olympics, the athletes that we've had make the NFL or get to whatever level that we've trained them to. John has his system. I don't do what he does. He doesn't do what I do. So my thoughts would be, I don't know. You would have to play around with it. And it's actually ironic because I think a lot of the endurance stuff even is like when I started to run, my classic strength and conditioning background, I was like, all right, well, if I'm going to try and run a marathon, like I should just squat more. That would be like the strength coach approach would just be just squat more and it'll solve all of your life problems. But I soon realized like I can't just squat more if I want to run farther. I need to actually understand the adaptation that I'm trying to get. Is it based around the fact that I had no mitochondrial volume and I needed to just increase that capillarization in my body first and build up some tendon strength to then be able to improve my cardiac output, to then improve my pace, to then be able to handle the long periods? And I think that's when we look at the system for what it is, it's important that like other coaches have their training systems and how they implement them and how they do them. Like, I can't say much because in my case, I have my own system of training and it's rooted in the experience that we have here. It's rooted in science and analysis of papers that we look at. And it's rooted in discussion with sport coaches and it's rooted in what we do inside the gym. And so that's what our system's built on. So I think that's all I can really do for that question. So sorry. Let's see. Is your video okay? How could a 4-day work week look like for handball? How would a 4-day work week or a training week look like for handball players in season? Potentially a full body workout on day 4. I don't know if you need to be in the gym 4 days a week in season. No, it depends on your level. If you're younger, for sure, it could be in there. This is from Michael Brilla. Yeah, I did coach Adam Mackey and Pete Renda. Actually, in the presentation I'm giving in front of the NSCA, I talk about Renda, and I'm going to come back to Samuel. I talked about Renda. So Pete Renda, this is a good example of how we try to break everything down. So Renda was one of the wrestlers that like checked all the boxes. Super strong, extraordinarily fast, had like a 35-inch vert, could back squat a house, single leg squatted over 315 for reps in high school, power snatched 97, 98 kilos like 2 weeks before he won a state championship. He was an NCAA All-American, got third at Division I NCAAs. And so with Pete, he was a good example of my lack of comprehension of the endurance realm at that time. So Pete could get into a match, and by the third period, he would be gassed. Now, his senior year, he spent most of the senior year ranked as number 1 in the country, okay, at NC State. So he's like the number 1 wrestler at the 184-pound weight class. Now, that weight class was stacked, and what ended up happening is he's in the quarterfinals, and he ends up wrestling a kid named Dominic Abinator, okay, from Michigan. And he had, like, barely beaten this kid multiple times, but, barely beat him. He goes to like 4 overtimes with Abinator and loses, okay, in the quarters, and then comes back at night and loses to the 7th ranked kid from Nebraska because he was gassed from that 4 overtime match. And so looking at it, you can understand then that now I'm looking at it going, Pete needed more long, slow distance to have that recovery to come back in that match against the Nebraska kid. He also needed more interval work. And the thing that I've discounted over my entire career is that I've always thought you can just improve endurance within like a 5 to 8 week time frame. It takes you can do that, but it also takes like 20 to 30 weeks of long work to really have a substantial impact on changing that. And I think that's one regret I have looking back on my career individually, is that as a strength coach, that's what I lacked early on. And that's what I've been trying to improve upon over the last, 3 to 5 years, really. So I did want to, just acknowledge that aspect. So going back to the question with the full body workout for handball, or I would just say like a full body workout in general, I would hit something like a power snatch or a power clean. Let's say you go off of 1 box, and then I would do something like this. I do like a front squat, like 4 sets of 5, moderate weight, and you do that with like a pull-up. Okay, so you do pull-ups for like 4 sets of 5 as well. Then you get into exercise 3A. 3A could be like a dumbbell bench. So now you're doing a upper body pressing. That takes priority in the 3s. And you do 3B would be like a single leg RDL. Okay, and then 4A, 4B could be like the hypertrophy work. So that's where like 4A could be, clap push-ups. 4B could be doing leg curls or something like that. So that's like a unique way to lay out a full body workout. Let me know if that helps. How did a leg power upper power day look for Nick Singleton in season when he was at GS? In season, that would be, again, 2 box power clean into a full clean, unbroken back squats or front squats, because that's going to be a little bit lighter, and then some type of work based off of what his needs were. Did he have a hip pointer, or was he tight in his hips or ankles? Whatever that problem area was, that's where we were doing that accessory work. All right, so this Wednesday, I will be at the NSCA convention presenting. If you guys want to download the Sport Depth document, in the chat, you can click on the free resource and download that today. Until next time, peace.